This is Theology Bits with Pastor Ben, a ministry of Central Lutheran Church. This week, we're talking about, in our series, A New Church, A New World, that we are doing on Tuesday nights on our Together Tuesday program. We're going to be talking about the question of secularization, or what Charles Taylor, who's going to be our author, talks about the secular age. And this is a topic that many of us know about, especially in the Pacific Northwest, which is often called the none zone, meaning that people are identifying religiously as none. And the difference between none and agnostic or atheist is that agnostic and atheist suggest we're at least asking the question about religiosity, whereas the concept of none is simply irrelevant. And it provides, as many people, a kind of religious illiteracy that is specific. And we'll talk about that more in the coming weeks. But this week, what I would like to talk about this issue of secularization. When and what does it mean that things have become secular? It was really popular, especially in the 1960s in scholarship, to look at secularization, and they were particularly looking at countries in Europe of suggesting that the world was becoming more secular and less religious. This was secularization hypothesis, especially, they were suggesting, the Enlightenment emphasized reason and that thereby, scientific method, that thereby there would be less religiosity. That actually turned out not to be very accurate, that they discovered that while church attendance might not have been as strong as before, we were still dealing with express religious belief. And so one famous scholar, Peter Berger, in the 1960s, had written a book about this called The Sacred Canopy that was sure that secularization was coming from a sociological perspective, and then in the year 2000 wrote an article that he was in fact wrong. It didn't show up the way he thought. And so Charles Taylor wrote a book not long ago called Our Secular Age. And he said the problem was not secularization, but the problem was we weren't thinking about it very carefully. And he divides secularization into three zones. The first would be institutional secularization, to say that if there are institutions actually denying people the freedom to be religious, to say, like, for example, most people know about the Soviet Union was a very oppositional view to religions, but it could be any state or any institution that is not allowing people to be religious, even if they wanted to, even if they didn't express it in public. That turned out to be very rare for that to occur. The second piece would be religiosity in public spaces. In what we call secularization 2 would be, well, people are very welcome to have their own private religious beliefs, but not welcome to express them in public. And some people can think about aspects of that. And that's a kind of secularization, even though it might include a lot of people with deep beliefs in public. Are they able to express them? That also turns out not to have really occurred in the way that they expected. People still are able to express religious belief in public, and sometimes it's perceived well and sometimes perceived poorly, but they're able to make those expressions. The third kind of secularization, or secularization 3, is what Taylor says is actually very common, is what he calls the conditions of belief. And by this, what he means is, what does it take for people in 2023 to believe in things? And he suggests that there are sometimes in society just norms and practices or praxis that come down to us that we all follow without thinking very much about. We learn it at a very young age. We copy what our parents do. We copy what our society does. And so we do that. And one of those things in some societies was religious practice. They're just things that simply happened to be a citizen and a member of society. You were religious, or at least went through the rituals. This is what Charles Taylor said, that is where secularization has in fact come about. There are very few people who simply follow religious practice because it's what you do in society. Instead, it's suggested that everyone knows there is an option. You do not have to be religious. It is not a requirement in society. Instead, if you're going to be religious, it's because of a rational decision you've made and a commitment that you've made to be religious. And this he calls what we would think of as actually secular. And here is where he looks to, this changes what it means to be religious in society. You're welcome to be religious, but you are the one making that choice. And so your self has been framed in a new way. How much do you allow yourself to be informed by society? Do you, in fact, need to make rational decisions about what society gives you? These norms and praxis that we just accept. Well, in fact, do we accept them or not? And he says what has happened is we have a buffered self. And it's not only religious people in this space, but all people in this space. As we define who we all are in a place of needing to do this as a decision rather than simply an acceptance of the norms and practices that society at large is giving us. Instead, we recognize we're going to manage. We're going to want to, in some way, control what it is we accept and what it is we do not. This, he says, is where the secular age shows up. And so it leads to questions of those who are religious making this decision, making this commitment. How do they, in fact, fit with the larger society around them? It's not that they're not allowed to be present, but do they fit in? Do they find themselves feeling estranged from the society around them? Do they find that it is harder because they have to make decisions, and if it's a social, coming from society, norms and praxis or practices that are coming forward, do they find much support for the way that they are organizing their life? We will be talking more about this on Tuesday and what that means for the world in which we live, for the church in which we live, but it starts by a more careful understanding of what is secularization, what is it not, and thereby how do we start understanding not just those outside the church, but even those of us, our own selves, inside the church. How has this affected who we are, deeply religious, but also living in a new secular age? This has been Theology Bits. I'm Pastor Ben.